All right. And again, so you can you see this? This is just showing you some of the major cities in Provence, which is southern France, very close to the Mediterranean Sea, except for Marseille, which of course is on the Mediterranean. The others are actually in the mountains. Very, very beautiful, beautiful country. They're not huge mountains like the Pyrenees, but I mean, some can went to greater heights than others, but most, I guess you could say them more like rolling hills. Very, very, very pretty. And again, this is southern France, pleasant climate for a good part of the year. Although in the winters, they can definitely get snow there, especially up in the mountainous regions. All right. So I think I will begin. Hopefully we have enough, and whoever comes in, will join us. Now, when I talk about the Jews of Provence, we are talking primarily going through the 12th and 13th centuries. There were definitely Jews who were living there already in the 11th century. We talked about one of the first great scholars coming out of Provence is Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, who was quoted quite a bit by Rashi. They lived in the same time period, right? That was the 11th century. But as I say, the bulk of that, what we call Chachmei Provence, the wise men of Provence, they are from the 12th and the 13th centuries. And by the 14th century, we'll see, I'll explain why, of course, the community will come to an end. And again, it's numerous communities, very numerous small towns spread out throughout, right, this mountainous region. And it also includes what we call Languedoc. And Languedoc is the area closer to the Pyrenees, and that is the most southern part of the country of France. Okay, so we talked about Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. He's the first of the very great Rabbanim from this time period. And philosophically, even their mode of learning, they were very closely aligned with the Jews of Spain, all right? Even though they're living in the same country as France, to the north are the Baalei Tosfot, but they really don't have much to do with them. I mean, they would certainly have exchanged letters back and forth when different things were published. They would have shared them with one another, but their attitude, their mode of thought, was much more closely aligned with those of the Jews of Spain. And don't forget, we're talking about now this period of time in southern Spain where the Almohads, or this fanatical Muslims coming from Morocco, are now in charge. So many Jews are now going to be leaving southern Spain, going to northern Christian Spain, which is not oppressing them at this time period. And then a number of those Jews will also go and settle in Provence. I don't think they would have gone over the Pyrenees because, as I say, they are extremely difficult. But if they were in Barcelona, that's a port on the Mediterranean. They could have gone on board a boat, Barcelona, sailed to Marseille, and then found themselves in those various communities throughout Provence. Okay. And we'll discuss this more at length. The greatest scholar then, from the 12th century period is the Rambam, Maimonides. Actually, my kids tell me I should say Rambam, okay, to differentiate him from Ramban, who is from the next century. Okay, but 12th century is Rambam. And then a controversy will arise over his works, and those Jews of Provence, those Rabbanim from that time period, they're going to get really involved with the controversy, but we'll do that a little later. I mentioned last time one of the great scholars from, again, we're into now the 12th century, was this Rabbi Zerachia Halevi of Lunel. He's known as the Razah, and he wrote a very famous work called the Sefer HaMaor, in which he criticizes, but in a very respectful manner, the writings of the Rif, who was from the previous century, all right, and who came originally from Morocco, but he's called Rabbi Afasia from Fez, but then he eventually did go to settle in Spain. And then we had talked about him the last time a most famous Rav from this time period is the Ravid. There actually were 3 Rabbanim who were called the Ravid, but this is Ravid the third. He is the most famous of all 3 of them. He came to settle eventually in Poitiers, and that's where he had a great yeshiva. He was a wealthy man. He helped support his yeshiva and the poor students who came to lead there. He's definitely seen as the leader for that century of the scholars of Provence. Now he had gotten into a dispute, with the Raza, the Rav whose name I mentioned just forward to this, and a strong. I feel he was an extremely strong personality. I'll tell you more about him, as we go on. He didn't agree with the Rambam and offered up certain criticisms. Some of them actually Rambam agreed to, but we'll go into that more when we're studying just the controversy. Now, the next very famous Rav from that time period is the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, and I'm sure some of you, when you've studied Nach in particular, his commentary on the Chumash is the only one we have extant today is on Bereshis, but mostly you study Radak because of his wonderful explanations on the Nevi'im and different. He also did Tehillim and Mishlei, and he very, very good interpretations. First, basic on the Peshat, and then he would add onto it from there. He also wrote polemics against Christianity. And then, as I say, because of his name was Kimchi, so I'd mentioned last time that from there, a phrase which is in Pirkei Avos, but is then also attributed, we're talking about, 1,000 years after Pirkei Avos, but is used to also describe Rabbi David Kimchi, or the Radak, and it says he made Kemach, right? Kemach on the Kimchi, Ein Torah, all right? Just to show his great brilliance. Now, he happened to have defended the Rambam, but that was in the latter part of his life. Okay, then we talked about the Ibn Tibbon family, who were great translators. And if you've ever even read a novel that's written, let's say, in a foreign language, whether with Russian or French or Hebrew, it's a great skill to be a really good translator into whatever vernacular you're using, but to get the nuance of whatever the original language was that something was written in. So he translated a lot of works that were originally written in Arabic, and they published them into beautiful Hebrew. His father had done this on several very key works, and then he's famous for translating the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim. There are other translations around. I'll mention at a later point another Rav who's known, but his is considered the best, the most authoritative, the most, the one most resonant with Rambam's words and his meaning. And he also translated parts of Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah as well. That book that he wrote, Igeret Teiman, to the Jews of Yemen, trying to give them chizuk at a very dark period in their lives. And he himself was a philosopher, and he traveled around to many countries. Now, here's another interesting person. I was not as familiar with him, but he obviously made some major contributions, so I wanted to include him. He's called Hameili. Again, we're still talking, we're now into the 13th century, and he came from the city of Narbonne. He lived from 1190 to 1263. And he wrote a book called Sefer HaMaorot, which was a commentary on the Gemara. He also wrote laws concerning writing a Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzot. And he also wrote a book called Melchemet Mitzvah, which was a defense. This is the time period of Louis IX, Louis the Pious, who demanded, that especially Rabbi Yechiel Pari had to go up. There was a big vikuach among who was an apostate in Paris, trying to show Christianity was better than Judaism. So it made no difference what arguments were on the side of the Jewish people. The Christians were bound to eventually be voted in as the winners. So he wrote a letter. Apparently, he was very incensed. I have to understand, at this time period, the King of France is not ruling over southern France at all. He's in the northern parts of central France, but not yet southern France. They are still linked. There was a Count of Barcelona who actually started ruling over that part of France, and so he obviously felt comfortable enough that he could write to Louis and denounce him for having had this trial. I like here. I'm going to read you here. It says he said the king was unfair in promulgating anti-Jewish legislation, and he pointed out Louis's attitude towards the Jews was ill-founded, ungrateful, impractical, and counterproductive. He reminded the king he would have to answer for his deeds before the heavenly tribunal. I don't know what effect it had on him, but he wrote this very strong letter. And he also wrote, I guess, interpretations of some of our tefillot and various halachos that deal with the things. There's another scholar, which I was so amazed to find out came from Provence. I don't know if any of you have ever used his works. He wrote a commentary on Chumash. His name is Chizkuni. And I remember, maybe when I was in high school, college, I can't remember, he was very popular. Again, beautifully written Hebrew, clear, could easily follow. And he's from this time period. We don't have his exact dates, but he's in like mid 13th century. And his commentary is called Chizkuni. I remember and you almost visualize it. It was separate volumes that I had looked at. Now, he's what we would call like a super commentary. So he obviously interjects some of his own opinions, but he's really like making a compilation of other great commentators from the past, particularly obviously Rashi. Okay, he would be one of the key ones, but also Ibn Ezra, and he read Rashbam's work. So he's presenting them in his own work as an amalgam, but he does give credit, to these various other Rabbanim. And apparently, I feel he's the very first, what we call the super commentaries, to write on Rashi's work. Okay, here's another person. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's called Ha'Meiri. Rabbi Menachem Ha'Meiri. He was a great commentator on the Talmud. He lived 1249 to 1306, right? Just into the very beginning of the 14th century in Perpignan. Apparently, he's. I'm doing Daf Yomi now, but I don't really study Gemara. Apparently, he's a highly quoted author when people do study the Gemara. And he wrote a book called Beit HaBechira, and it's a summary of the entire Talmud and the different commentaries on it and different halachic approaches, to what's written in the Gemara. And I guess it's beautifully organized. Okay, he also wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avos. And in it reminds me actually of the Rambam. He traces like the lineage of Torah Shebe'al Peh. I mean, the Rambam does that in his Mishnah Torah at the beginning of his works. He tries to show the direct line, from Moshe, to Aaron and to Yoshua, et cetera, down through the ages. And then Ha'Meiri, obviously he lived beyond, Rambam dies in the early 1200s. So, he's writing this, like almost 100 years ago. So he's continuing to have a list there of all various great Rabbanim, how they are in that chain of the oral law. All right. And apparently it is used, or I don't know, nowadays we have so many other books that have since come out, but it was used as for those who started then writing more historical works, which really will happen centuries later. But it's a great source that historians will look into to see delineate, from one generation to the next, the passage of the Torah Shebe'al came down to us. And he was very close to the Rambam in his viewpoint. Obviously, I told you he lives after the Rambam. And he became a very strong defender of him. All right. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some philosophers that have come out of this time period. And I said I'm going to make it a separate unit, but now is going to be this huge controversy that's going to arise over those who are going to defend Rambam's works and those who are opposed to it. And I was trying to understand, I mean, he was a man of great brilliance who wrote these magnificent works of Torah. And why was this awful controversy? I think part of the problem was that starting around, I would say it has to start already in the 13th century, because I told you the Jews of Provence, you won't hear so much about them anymore after certainly by mid 14th century. That there were inroads into the Jewish community of other modes of thought. And the Rabbanim, or many of the Rabbanim, as a result, were fearful that if one studied philosophy, you were exposed to outside modes of thought. It would dissuade you from continuing in the path of Torah learning and observance of the mitzvot. So I think as a result, so maybe they made the Rambam almost, that as if blaming him, whereas he had the most lofty of intentions in his works, and he's trying to show the grandeur and the magnificence of Yahadus. He's certainly not doing that. He was just trying to say, oh, well, there's, no difference. You can understand, we can reconcile, different modes of thought. But in the minds of some people, again, maybe they saw there was some fracturing within their own individual communities, and they were very frightened of, of having the, especially I would imagine the younger Jews, being exposed to other ways of thinking. And I mentioned this even last time we were talking more about the Rambam. I mean, that argument goes down to this very day. Does one have to be fearful of being exposed to other ways of thought? But the problem is, in many of these Rabbanim, whether pro or con, that you need a firm foundation in your, Yahadus and in your Torah learning. And if you don't have that, right, then if you are exposed to other ways of thinking, that might unfortunately sway you and you go off the path, unfortunately. All right. So one other just person I'll mention in general, his name is Rabbi Yedaya Panini. He came from the town of Bezier. He wrote a book on Jewish ethics. I won't tell you too much about him. He also wrote on the explanations of Ibn Ezra, on his commentary on the Torah. I'm trying to get to those that perhaps you'd be a little more familiar. Now, this man I have heard of, his name is Rabbi Yosef Kaspi. He lived from 1280 to 1340. He came from a town called Argentière. And argent, French, that's money. It's a coin. So that's why he's called Kaspi, from the word kesef, which also means money. He was in favor of the study of philosophy. You don't have to be afraid of it. It's okay. It will add to your understanding of Judaism. It's, nothing to be fearful of. He also wrote many works. Apparently wrote over 40 works on Torah topics, and commentary on some of the Nevi'im. And he also wrote a Hebrew dictionary. And he also wrote apparently a 2-part commentary on Rambam's the Moreh Nevuchim. That was the key. The key problem was Moreh Nevuchim, whether one could, because that is definitely a philosophical work in total. And was it correct or safe for Jews to be exposed and to learn the guide to the perplexed? All right, he traveled to many different places. Eventually, he, even though he comes from Provence, in later years, he went and he lived in Mallorca, Spain. Now, this person, I'm sure you've heard of him, that's Ralbag. All right, and he's also goes into that mid 14th century. He is considered to be the greatest Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages after Rambam. I mean, nobody can compare to Rambam in his brilliance, right, and his stature. But Ralbag, his name is Rabbi Levi ben Gershon. His years are 1288 to 1344. Came from the town of Bagnon. And he's also known as Gersonides. So sometimes you might read someplace and you see Gersonides, that's Ralbag. Now, he also, like Rambam, he studied Aristotle, so his mode of thinking was what we would call Aristotelian. He wrote a commentary on Tanakh, and I know, I also teach the Book of Kings, Malachim Aleph, and a lot of quotations will come from Rabbah. See Radak a lot, and I will see Rabbah, and of course Rashi. Rashi's always the preeminent one, and then later on also Barbanel, who's one of my favorite commentators. He wrote a book called Milchamot Hashem. Again, it's a philosophical treatise, and he got dumped on for that. He was criticized for that. He was trying to rationalize some of the miracles, try to understand, well, how did they occur? And people would say that, but, like that's an anathema, like it's almost like heretical. And, so he was, not well received in certain circles. But he did write also works on the Talmud, and those apparently were well received. I guess I didn't find anything controversial in those works. Apparently he was also an astronomer, and he wrote books on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. So interesting, quite a number of these great Rabbanim did also study medicine. So I think that's quite interesting. And some of his works actually were translated from the Hebrew into Latin. So that would have been known, some of these works, the more general nature would have then been known to Christian scholars. Okay, let me see what else. Now, here's an interesting person. Now, I was not as familiar with his name, but when I heard the title of the book that he wrote, yes, it lit up, a light for me. And his name is Rabbi Eshtori HaParchi. He lived from the year 1280 to 1345. He was a brilliant scholar, also a philosopher. A lot of his works were on ethics and the sciences also that are mentioned in the Gemara. But his most famous work is Kaftor Vaferach. So first off, Kaftor Vaferach, that's, when in the Torah it's describing the building of the menorah, the magnificent golden menorah, the Betzalel. Well, actually, it's, they were having trouble figuring it out. So they say, actually, it's from Rashi, that, they like to put the gold there, and then Hashem sort of fashioned the menorah. Anyhow, the Kaftor Vaferach, those are those knobs and flowers that, are on the branches, as for decorations. So he wrote this book, he called it Kaftor Vaferach, and in which, he discusses the boundaries, the history, the halachos, and geography of Eretz Yisrael. He actually traveled to Israel, and for 7 years, he crisscrossed the country to examine, I guess, where was everything located, mentioned, right, throughout Tanakh. So in this book, he'll talk about the geography, and again, the historical significance of various locations. And for me, this personally was so exciting. So when I was doing, preparing for my Malachim Aleph class, and they certainly mentioned different parts of it's now I'm talking about Shlomo's reign and different what he built here, there, and there. And what's the reference? Where do we get some of the information from? This book, Kaftor Vaferach. So it's so nice when you can combine, what you've learned in two different disciplines and see the relationship with them. Apparently, he eventually settled, actually, and lived in Beit Shan. If you know Beit Shan, very hot there. That's all I can remember from having visited there many, many years ago. There's actually a beautiful Roman amphitheater there, but it's very, very hot. It's further north, like on the edge of sort of the Galil. All right. So I thought that was interesting to learn about this man. All right. and apparently, even though he comes originally from Provence, he did go to Spain for a while, right? And then he went to live in Israel. Okay. So for 3 centuries, right? So starting already, I told you in that 11th century, right? 12th, 13th, just the beginning of the 14th, it's going to, be changing somewhat. The Jews of Provence, you can see by look how many, famous Rabbanim, came from that time period. And really these were small towns. They were separated from one another. There was never a huge Jewish population there at all. I mean, some of it was augmented after the Almohads had taken over southern Spain, so some more people did go to live there, but there were never large Jewish communities. But the scholarship that came from that time period is truly amazing. But naturally, unfortunately, in this medieval period, it will come to an end, and there will be persecutions there. And just want to explain to you what happened. So, at the end of this, it's already, we'll start in the 13th century. There was something called the Albigensian crusade. They were heretics, in the view of the Catholic Church. And I know they had some system of duality. I don't fully understand it. In any case, the Pope did not like them whatsoever. And there already had been several crusades. Obviously, what was their purpose originally? To go to the Holy Land and rest Jerusalem, back, from the infidels. Okay. Well, that didn't end up working out so great in the end, because eventually the Muslims did take it back. Although, the Crusaders did rule there for quite a long time. And even after Saladin had reconquered, Jerusalem for the Arabs, there were still Crusaders, towns living in various parts of Israel. Didn't become like totally Muslim overnight. In any case, I guess it was these Albigensians, they were considered, a danger to the Catholic Church. They would influence other people. They were literally just in the Provence area. But the Pope, his name was Innocent III. I love those names. Decided like enough was enough. And so he called for a crusade against them. It lasted quite a while. Then the main part was from the year 1209 to the year 1215, but it continued beyond for, sporadically up until the year 1229. But what it gave the King of France was now he's going to consolidate his powers and expand his territory. And he's going to call up the troops. They're going to go now into southern France and regain control over that part of the world, and make it all Catholic. Now, this is before the Huguenots. It was a Protestant, so we're talking about centuries later. But, again, these are Albigensians. And apparently it started in a town called Albi, which I had not heard of before, someplace in southern France. And this is also the time period where the Dominicans, we'll learn later about the Dominican friars, their head is this man who's now, they call him Saint Dominic, who established this order of preachers. And, he came down to the Provence area and began preaching and spreading what he thought as the truth, which was that as interpreted by the Catholic Church. All right. But you can understand this seems to always happen. So here you could say it's an internecine struggle between two groups of Christians. All right. It's the Catholic North and these Albigensians living in the southern part of, and it's not like they were all Albigensians either. They were definitely loyal Catholic adherents, still living there in Provence. But naturally, as long as you're on the, you're going about attacking people. So those Jews, those wily Jews who they certainly don't accept anything, don't see anything true about Christianity. Let's attack them as well. And now, and especially once the French king, finally was ultimately successful, in this ultimate battle of control. And, you know, he had already been famous for expelling Jews, and it's just going to be like a death knell for the Jews of Provence. Okay, so I've concluded that section. Let me just make sure I've done everything else. Okay, all right. But now let's go back. We're going to like backtrack slightly to talk about that huge controversy over the Rambam's work. So some of the Rabbanim whose names I have now mentioned, you will now hopefully now recognize their names, but I'm going to put it in the context of this huge, ugly controversy that arose, whether to accept, you know, Rambam's works in our, mostly his philosophical works, right, in the canon of Jewish learning, or, you know, is his attitude against specifically dealing with the study of philosophy, is that a good or is that a potential evil? All right. Again, he dies in the year 1204. So some of the controversy obviously will start in his lifetime, as his works, you know, will be proliferated and sent out to various Jewish communities. But you'll see who is arguing about this. It's the Jews in the Sephardic world. Those Jews living up north, the Ashkenazi Jews, they don't get involved in this whatsoever, but they don't study philosophy in any case, you know. So it really didn't impact them, and they're not part of the fray. You'll see it's going to be the Jews of the Provence, Spain, and we'll even go into the Middle East, as I'll explain in a little bit. All right. Mostly, there's some controversy about Mishnah Torah, although by and large, it's accepted as the most brilliant work of halacha. But, you know, there are aspects of it that people found to be problematic. I'll explain some of those. And particularly, this was against the book of Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. And again, is it a positive to study philosophy, general philosophy, even if you want to apply it or couch it in Jewish terms? You know, will this enhance your knowledge and appreciation of Torah, or is it such a terrible thing? It's so dangerous. It's, you know, potentially so very damaging that let's totally banish these works and, you know, and not study them whatsoever. All right. So the first one that I want to mention is the Ramah. He was one of the earliest opponents to the Rambam's works. His name is Rabbi Meir Halevi Abulafia. He lived from 1180 to 1244, and he was a judge actually in Toledo, Spain. He's a very great Talmudic scholar, and he wrote a book called Yad Ramah, you know, which is a commentary on some of the tractates of the Talmud. So where he sort of wrote his main polemics against the Rambam's works, apparently that appears in chapter 11 of the Gemara Sanhedrin. I'm not up to there yet. But when I come, now it will make sense to me. You know, I'll remember about the Ramah. So he criticizes the Rambam for not giving enough emphasis to certain basic principles of Yahadus, including Techiyas HaMesim, revival of the dead. All right, a lot of the controversy is going to be about things like this, Techiyas HaMesim, you know, the resurrection, et cetera, et cetera. Now, apparently, the Rambam has, you know, in his works, when he talks about Olam Haba, you know, what's the world to come? What's it going to be like? It says it's going to be totally incorporeal. In other words, there won't be bodies; they will be souls. All right. So what's that thing with the Gilgul Neshama? You know, you could understand why it became very controversial, you know, and hard for everybody to accept. And Rabbi Meir, you know, he corresponded with people through Provence and Spain. So a lot of the things, his criticisms, you know, we're not going to gain a wide audience. And he was still trying to be respectful. No, he's not one of the crazy fanatic critics of the Rambam, which will occur at a later date. But because he was one of the very first to start voicing these doubts and throwing some aspersions on the Rambam's writings, you know, it will gain eventually more and more followers, and they will become more and more antagonistic. And the other one is the Ravid. Now, I don't know this man personally, but he must have been one tough customer, right? He was also a very early opponent of the Rambam, and he attacked him particularly on, I think I mentioned this when I had discussed the Ravid, that when he felt that a lot of the Mishnah Torah was like a compilation of all the halachas, as the ones that Rambam wanted to include on the entire Torah, but he doesn't explain or give a source for how we came to the decision. Oh, in such and such a case, this is what we should do, how we should follow it. Again, remember the Gemara is just discussions. Rabbi so and so says this, Rabbi so and so says that, and then the third Rabbi says, another opinion. So there was no standard work of halacha, and so that was the brilliance of what the Rambam did when he wrote his Mishnah Torah, because he puts in an organizing, and I told you, magnificent, easy to understand Hebrew. What are the halachas? It's a topical arrangement of the various laws of the Torah. But again, he did not provide sources for where he had, where had he seen what's the decision, So this is one of the things that the Ravid attacked him for in particular. And actually, Rambam took this very well. He felt that that it was legitimate, and that he should by right have perhaps. But at this point, he's living in Egypt. I don't think he has the time. Remember, I told you he was a physician there. Worked all day long, and then only was able to involve and engage himself in expanding his works on Torah, in the evening hours. So he does respond to him and say, you're right, but he doesn't still never had the opportunity. And just so that we do study the Mishnah Torah in this day and age, but the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo will supersede this as the authoritative work of halacha. Okay. And even though we're not there yet, just so you know, the Shulchan Aruch was by Rabbi Yosef Karo. It's a Sephardic interpretation of what the halacha is, and then in Europe is the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Israelis, and he wrote the Ashkenazi. It wasn't a whole total new work, but he would take different ways. The Rabbi Yosef Karo had interpreted what the halacha is from a Sephardic perspective, and then wrote it down into an Ashkenazi perspective, and that's who we would follow him. Okay, let me see what else. And apparently, this Ravid, he wrote like hundreds of criticisms of the Rambam. It wasn't like he just made a general statement. Oh, well, where are your sources? That's not right. Blah blah blah. He kept on like dumping on him things that he didn't like. Although he said, oh yes, in fact, but the Mishnah Torah was a very brilliant, work. But meanwhile, he has these constant criticisms that are coming out of him. Apparently, Mishnah Torah editions, starting with the 15th century, include the Ravid's works. Maybe that's why he's so famous, the Ravid, because if you buy a work of the Mishnah Torah, that includes Mefarshim, he's one of the prominent ones, that you will see. All right. Let me see. He himself then wrote a book. Again, he had attacked. Oh, the Rambam. Sorry, I wanted to say he wrote a counterattack. He wrote an essay on the topic of resurrection. Right, Jahel Samesim. He wanted to say no. They're trying to explain what his thoughts and philosophy were concerning it, and but he's still obviously staunch Torah observer, and now that a lot of those Chachmei Provence, more and more of them are going to get involved in this controversy and start writing different polemics about it, whether pro or con. Now it's interesting, again, the Rambam, he must have been this most unusual, wonderful person. Or here he's getting these attacks from these people, although apparently up until this point, they're somewhat respectful. But he told those people who wanted to write in his defense, let's not get involved in personal arguments here. Let's just keep this, on a high level. Even somebody might be writing in very harsh terms, but we need to respond to them in very moderate, works, and our arguments should always be very calm. And he felt that people, they were criticizing him, but that he felt that they were sincere, in their writings. And if somebody, started writing it in a very ugly way, so just ignore them. It's not worth, don't get involved, right? And I told you he wrote this book about Techias HaMesim to try to explain where he was coming from. And I guess in his latter years, and also certainly upon his death, his son was Rabbi Avraham, who lived from 1186 to 1237. So he kept up, this correspondence with these various Rabbanims and those who come after, always obviously defending his father's stance and interpretation of things. Okay, just a little bit about this Rabbi Avraham, that he succeeded his father as the court physician, right, in Fostat, Cairo, and he was then also recognized as the leader of the Egyptian Jewish communities. Apparently, he was only 19 years old when his father died, but I guess he himself was a great scholar, and as I say, he was considered to be a physician of great repute. And so he's known to be one of the staunchest, obviously, defenders of his father's works and writings. Okay, and he also engaged with Shelot and Teshuvot, with Jews in other communities. And that's it. Okay, but now we're going to see how it turned extremely ugly. All right. The Rambam, as I mentioned before, he dies in the year 1284. And that's the end of any sort of moderate tone or anything. It's like gloves off, full scale battle between the proponents of whether pro or con Rambam and the study of philosophy. I don't know quite why, but a lot of the controversy seemed to center around the town of Montpellier. And one of the first ones who I'm going to mention to you, I love his name. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Min Hahar. That means he's Rabbi Shlomo from the mountain. So, again, remember I told you Provence, we're talking about these lovely, like rolling hills, again, some of the mountains are a bit higher than others. So I just love that name that he had. He lived from the year 1170 to 1238. He was a great Talmudist, but boy, did he attack the Rambam's ideas of rationality and certainly his philosophic works. He felt that that if people study them, again, it's going to lead. They're going to leave the Jewish fold, blah blah blah. And he demands a ban on the works of the Rambam, and they can and really condemned him and his writings, in a very, very harsh manner. And apparently, I told you, he actually, sets up this word, it needs to be a ban on the Rambam's works. But the other rabbis of Provence at that point were not going along with him. So then in the year 1232, he got really angry about it. And he put out a rabbinic ban ostracizing anybody who studies the philosophic works of Rambam. So it didn't matter if the other people wouldn't agree with him. He's taken it upon himself, as his Rav, he's banning them. And then there were some other disciples of his who obviously also signed on to this ban. One was a man, his name was Rabbi Yonah. He came from Girona, which is actually north of Barcelona. So he is a Spanish Jew. He lived from 1180 to 1263. He also was a great Talmudic scholar. He wrote a commentary on the Gemara and on the Rif in his writings. He apparently wrote a work on piety and ethics called Sha'arei Teshuvah. Apparently it's considered to be a classic, work of Torah thought. And he sort of wrote it as a result of this conflict you got into over whether, it's proper to study the Rambam's works. Apparently he was a great orator. And again, he was friendly with his Shlomo, Midhahar, and he traveled to many, many different countries and preaching that one should ban, the study of the Rambam's works. But apparently, though, later in life, he regretted, what he had done. that he was spilling all this venom all over the place. And he actually had wanted to, it didn't quite work out. He actually wanted to go all the way to Israel, to Tveria, to visit the Rambam's grave and to beg his forgiveness, but he died before that in Toledo. And apparently in Toledo, he was the head of the great yeshiva there. Now, remember, I told you there are other people who are going to get involved in this, not just Jews of Provence and Jews of Spain, but Jews in the Middle East. I think this is so interesting. So this dispute, right, whether to ban, right, the Rambam's works, it went all the way to the city of Baghdad. Now, you might have thought, oh, gee, what happened to that Babylonian Jewish community? I mean, after the period of the Gonim, what, did they all leave? No, they did not all leave. There were still, thousands and thousands of Jews still living in Babylon. It just, there are not as many great scholars coming from that time period, so we don't hear about it so much. And apparently the Rav there was named Rabbi Shmuel ben Eli from 1140 to the year 1209. And he also said, we need to ban the Rambam's works. They're dangerous. You shouldn't be studying them. Apparently he was the head of the largest yeshiva that existed at that time in Babylonia. And apparently thousands of students came to his lectures. He was a wealthy man. He had a lot of influence. And obviously he disagreed with so many of even the Rambam's halachic decisions besides his views on philosophy. He didn't like what he wrote about those Jews in Yemen, you remember, who felt they were forced to outwardly live as Muslims, even though in their homes they still continue to live as Jews. And and Rambam tried to give them chizuk and to say, that he sympathized and he understood, what a difficult position they were in. But he was like, no, that was wrong. That they should not have converted to Islam whatsoever. And of course, obviously, he for sure was against the study of philosophy and particularly the study of Moreh Nevuchim. And apparently, now remember, I told you he dies in 1209. Rambam dies in 1204. So he was one of the main people criticizing Rambam, actually, even in his lifetime. All right. But now, all these people now calling for the banning of the Rambam's works. So then there were others arose who said, well, let's ban the works of those people. This just became very, very ugly. So Radak, I mentioned him earlier, he's already a very old man, but he was pulled into this fray. And he, remember, he comes from Provence, but he travels all the way to Spain, where a lot of this, ugly controversy is raging. And he's trying, he's in the writing and talking about in defense of Rambam. But eventually this whole dispute just gets totally out of hand. I'm just going to finish this one paragraph here. This is the most horrible thing. When I read this, I just couldn't believe that they sunk so low. So now there's a group now, okay, these people who are like diehard opponents. Reminds me of our political situation in the United States. They were diehard opponents of the Rambam's works, especially those dealing with philosophy. So the idiots, they go and they denounce his works to the church. Big mistake. How stupid to get, now the non-Jewish world involved. So what would the church care one way or the other? But in Rambam's works, and this is true, there is criticism of Christianity. He actually saw, more to admire, so to speak, in Islam, and their interpretation of how to worship God, whereas, he felt like Christianity, especially with all the idols, the statue, whatever. So, otherwise, why would the church care? You want to study the Rambam's work? You don't want to study them? What's it to them? He was writing against Christianity. Fine. And what did they do? So the copies, numerous copies of the Rambam's works, they're confiscated, I guess, all over France, and they were burned in a public square in Paris. I mean, what a shanda that they stooped so low. And, obviously those who were adherents of banning the Rambam's works, they thought this was fantastic. Now they're vindicated, in their struggle. They want to purge Judaism of all sorts of false ideas. But I can imagine how other decent-minded Jews, how they felt when this happened. They were ashamed. They were heartsick. Oh my God, that the works of this great scholar, this holy man, you're burning them, and you're under the auspices of the church. Terrible. And so just think about this. I mean, I had those of you who were with me when I was talking about what happened. Again, we're talking about that Louis IX, a pious, and in 1242 there was this huge burning in that exact same square. So we're talking about 9 years after, okay, because of getting the church involved, with a dispute over Maimonides' works. Then 9 years later, they're going to confiscate. They went. I think it was on Shabbos, and most of the Jews were in shul. They went into Jewish homes and they stole out of them all sorts of Jewish works, and apparently among them were all the existing works of Gemara that existed in that day in France, and they burned them all in that same very square in the year 1242. They said there were 24 cartloads. These are all handwritten manuscripts. Just awful. Later on, just as what's going to happen again, because of the Albigensian that heretical or viewed as heretical heretics to Catholicism, then the king got involved, and he's now his dominion is now also over southern France, and then those same laws that are going to be where they talk about the expulsion of Jews from France. I mean, it will start in 1309 and go all the way to 1394. In, out. So the Jews of Provence are also obviously going to be caught up in this. And so really, when we talk about the, I would say even by mid-14th century, we will not hear any more about the Jews of Provence. I'm sure some continue to stay on, to live there, but certainly the great scholars, they're not going to come from there anymore. Next time we'll talk about the Ramban, because he was a key voice in moderation, to try to quell all this ugliness, in the Jewish world vis-a-vis the Rambam and his works on philosophy. But we'll do that next time, because, there's more to say. So it didn't just disappear. The controversy will go on for, and I think in general that the argument, the attitude about secular learning, I mean, I can sort of see both viewpoints. Obviously, I favor more the fact that you don't have to be afraid of learning other modes of philosophy. But the key is, I say, you must be well versed and, have a very firm faith and knowledge of Judaism before you could, God forbid, allow yourself to be influenced by other modes of thought. So again, I hope everybody's well. Stay healthy. Good to see all of you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Malka.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Be well.
Yes. So hopefully next year we'll start.